Andrew Harrington, a 55-year-old law enforcement veteran with a storied career, had finally returned to his hometown of Clayton Ridge, a quiet, tight-knit community nestled in the Midwest. For Andrew, this was more than just a homecoming. It was a mission. After years of serving in various departments across the state, earning a reputation for his unwavering commitment to integrity and justice, Andrew was back to take the reins as the newly appointed chief of police. Clayton Ridge had been struggling with reports of corruption and abuse within the police department, and Andrew's mandate was clear: clean house and rebuild trust. Driving down a deserted highway in his old, rusted pickup truck, Andrew felt a mix of nostalgia and resolve. His truck wasn't much to look at, but it had been with him through countless challenges and triumphs. The dashboard was littered with small reminders of his journey: a worn keychain from his first precinct, a faded photo of his late wife, and a small notepad filled with ideas for the reforms he hoped to implement. Andrew's signature red cap sat snugly on his head, a symbol of his personal beliefs and the values he held dear. It wasn't just a hat. It was a reminder of his commitment to standing firm in his convictions, even when they weren't popular. He was fully aware that it drew attention, and not always the good kind. But Andrew Harrington was a man who faced challenges head-on, unshaken by petty judgments or prejudices. The highway stretched endlessly before him, flanked by dense woods that seemed to swallow the moonlight. The solitude allowed his mind to wander, reflecting on the task ahead. He knew the department had a history of shady practices, reports of favoritism, mishandled cases, and an unspoken culture of arrogance among some officers. Andrew had been brought in to break that cycle, to set a new standard, but he also knew the road would be far from smooth. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden flash of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. The sharp wail of a siren pierced the quiet night. Andrew furrowed his brow, his first thought being that it must be a routine stop. He hadn't been speeding, and his paperwork was up to date. Maybe it was a busted tail light he hadn't noticed. Easing off the gas, he pulled over to the side of the road, the gravel crunching beneath his tires. As the patrol car stopped behind him, two officers emerged. The first, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a smug grin, swaggered toward the driver's side. His name tag read, Henderson. Behind him, a wiry man with a baton spinning casually in his hand followed. His badge identified him as Officer Dempsey. Their body language screamed authority, but it was laced with an arrogance Andrew had seen too many times before. Andrew rolled down his window as Henderson leaned casually against the truck, his smirk widening. "Evening, sir. You know why we pulled you over?" he asked, his tone almost condescending. Andrew met his gaze evenly. "I'm not sure, officer. I wasn't speeding, and everything should be in order." Henderson tilted his head, feigning thoughtfulness. "Well, your headlight's out," he said finally, though Andrew caught the slight hesitation in his voice. It sounded more like an excuse than a genuine reason. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle?" Andrew raised an eyebrow but complied, unbuckling his seatbelt and stepping out. His calm demeanor seemed to irk the officers more than anything. Henderson leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he took in Andrew's cap. "Nice hat," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Big fan of slogans, huh? Think that makes you special?" Andrew stayed calm. "It's just a hat," he replied evenly. "Now, is there a problem beyond the headlight?" Dempsey circled the truck, tapping the hood lightly with his baton. "You seem awfully relaxed for someone pulled over on a deserted road," he commented, his voice carrying an undercurrent of suspicion. "Got somewhere important to be, old man?" Andrew took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't about to let their provocations get the better of him. "Actually," he said, "I'm the new chief of police in Clayton Ridge." This must be a misunderstanding. For a moment, the two officers froze, exchanging a glance. Then Henderson let out a loud laugh, slapping his knee. "Chief of police? That's a good one," he said, turning to Dempsey. "What do you think, Mr. President? Should we roll out the red carpet?" Dempsey smirked. "Maybe he's running for mayor next," Real upstanding citizen we've got here. Andrew's jaw tightened, but he refused to rise to the bait. If you'll check my credentials, you'll see I'm telling the truth, he said, his voice steady. Henderson's grin only widened. Sure, sure, he said mockingly. But first, why don't you step over here? Just want to make sure everything checks out. Before Andrew could respond, Dempsey moved behind him, grabbing his arms and twisting them back. What's this about? Andrew asked, his voice calm but firm, as Dempsey slapped a pair of handcuffs onto his wrists. Oh, just being thorough, Dempsey replied with a smirk. Can't be too careful these days, right? As Henderson rummaged through Andrew's truck, pulling out items and tossing them carelessly onto the ground, Andrew stood silently, his mind racing. He had dealt with men like these before, officers who thought their badge was a license for abuse. But this wasn't just about him. This was about the culture he'd come to change, a culture that was now staring him in the face. Look at this, Henderson said, holding up Andrew's cap like it was evidence in a crime. Big patriot over here. Think this makes you untouchable? You're making a mistake, Andrew said, his voice steady but firm. Henderson laughed again. Oh, yeah? And what are you going to do about it, Chief? He said mockingly, tossing the cap back into the truck. Relax, old man. We're just doing our job. Andrew stood still, his expression unreadable. He knew better than to argue. His time would come, but for now, he had to endure. As the officers continued their search, Andrew's thoughts turned to his purpose. He had come to Clayton Ridge to set a new standard, to root out the kind of behavior he was now witnessing firsthand. Little did these two officers know, their actions were the catalyst that would ignite his mission in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. The metallic clang of the cuffs tightened around Andrew's wrists as Officer Dempsey gave them a firm tug. Andrew exhaled slowly, fighting the urge to react. His years in law enforcement had taught him the value of patience, even when faced with blatant injustice. Henderson and Dempsey, however, seemed to relish the opportunity to flex their authority. Let's take a little ride, Chief, Henderson said, his grin wide with misplaced confidence. He grabbed Andrew by the arm and guided him to the back seat of their patrol car, shoving him in without care for his age or stature. The door slammed shut, and Andrew found himself staring through the reinforced glass at the dark stretch of road ahead. As the car sped off, Andrew silently assessed his situation. This wasn't just a traffic stop gone wrong. It was a display of unchecked arrogance. He glanced at the dashboard camera, still recording. He had noticed earlier that the officers hadn't disabled it, an oversight that could be their undoing. For now, he needed to stay calm and let the night play out. In the front seats, Henderson and Dempsey shared a laugh as they bantered about their impromptu adventure. Think he's really the chief? Dempsey asked, half joking. Henderson snorted. Please, if he was, he wouldn't be driving that piece of junk. Probably just some washed-up wannabe trying to play hero. Andrew shifted slightly in his seat but said nothing. Their words didn't anger him. They fueled his resolve. The car turned off the main highway onto a narrow dirt road flanked by towering trees. The headlights struggled to pierce the darkness, casting eerie shadows across the uneven terrain. Andrew felt the tension in the air shift. This wasn't a typical procedure. They were taking him somewhere isolated, and whatever they had planned wasn't part of any handbook. The car came to a screeching halt in a small clearing, the silence of the night engulfing them. Henderson stepped out first, opening Andrew's door with a dramatic flourish. End of the line, he said, motioning for Andrew to step out. Andrew climbed out of the car, his calm demeanor only further irritating the officers. What now? He asked, his voice steady. Oh, you'll see, Henderson replied, pulling a frayed rope from the trunk. Dempsey stood by with a smirk, his baton tapping against his palm rhythmically. Andrew watched as they dragged an old metal post from the side of the road, likely a remnant of an abandoned marker. They shoved him against it, wrapping the rope tightly around his chest and arms, securing him in place. The coarse fibers bit into his jacket, but Andrew didn't flinch. His silence only seemed to embolden them. "There we go," Dempsey said, stepping back to admire their handiwork. "How's that for a welcome back to Clayton Ridge?" "You're making a mistake," Andrew said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will." Henderson leaned in, his face inches from Andrew's. "Is that a threat, old man? Because you don't seem to be in a position to make any." Andrew held his gaze. "It's a promise." Henderson chuckled, clearly unfazed. He reached into the patrol car and pulled out Andrew's red cap, placing it crookedly on his own head. "How do I look?" he asked, spinning on his heel like he was on a runway. "Pretty patriotic, huh?" Dempsey laughed, snapping a picture with his phone. The flash briefly illuminated the clearing, highlighting Andrew's unyielding expression. "Maybe we'll make you the department's new mascot," Dempsey joked. "Enjoy this while it lasts," Andrew said, his tone carrying a weight that made both officers hesitate for a brief moment. "Because it's going to be the last time you ever pull a stunt like this." Henderson recovered quickly, tossing the cap back into the truck. "We'll see about that," he said with a sneer. He climbed into the driver's seat, with Dempsey following close behind. The engine roared to life, and the car sped off, leaving Andrew tied to the post in the middle of nowhere. The red taillights disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the faint whisper of wind and the distant rustle of leaves. Andrew tested the ropes, feeling their rough texture bite into his skin. They had done their job well. He wasn't getting free without help. He glanced around, the forest's oppressive silence broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl. Despite the circumstances, Andrew's mind was sharp, already formulating a plan. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The cold gnawed at his fingers, and his legs ached from standing still. Andrew focused on his breathing, keeping himself calm. He'd been through worse in his career, but this wasn't about survival. It was about justice. Suddenly, the faint sound of footsteps broke through the stillness. Andrew straightened, his senses on high alert. A beam of light cut through the darkness, and a voice called out. "Who's out there?" the voice demanded, gruff but laced with concern. The flashlight's beam landed on Andrew, illuminating his restrained figure. The man holding it stepped closer, revealing a wiry frame clad in a flannel jacket and work boots. "What in the world happened here?" the man asked, his voice a mix of shock and anger. "Long story," Andrew replied, "but I could use a hand getting out of this." The man didn't hesitate. He set the flashlight down and pulled out a pocket knife, working quickly to saw through the ropes. "Whoever did this to you ought to be ashamed of themselves," he muttered under his breath. Within moments, Andrew was free. He stumbled forward, catching himself on the post as blood rushed back into his arms. "Thank you," he said, flexing his fingers. "You have no idea how much I appreciate this." The man gave him a once-over, clearly trying to piece together the situation. "You sure you're okay? Looks like you've been through hell." "I'll be fine," Andrew replied. "But I need to get back to the station. There are a couple of officers who have some explaining to do." The man's eyebrows shot up. "Officers did this to you? What kind of operation are they running around here?" Andrew's jaw tightened. "The kind that's about to change." The man nodded, his expression resolute. "Well, my truck's not far from here. Let me give you a lift." Andrew hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'd appreciate that." As they walked toward the truck, Andrew's mind raced. He had evidence. He had witnesses. And now, he had a reason to act swiftly. By the time the headlights of the truck lit up the dirt road, Andrew Harrington's resolve was set. This night wouldn't define him. It would define his department. The truck's engine rumbled as it bounced along the uneven road, its headlights casting long, erratic shadows against the trees. Andrew Harrington sat in the passenger seat, his fists resting on his knees, knuckles white with restraint. His rescuer, who had introduced himself as Earl, a retired mechanic who had seen more than his fair share of trouble in the quiet town of Clayton Ridge, kept glancing sideways at Andrew, clearly curious about the stoic man beside him. "You gonna tell me what this is all about?" Earl asked finally, his voice cutting through the tension. Andrew sighed, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Let's just say it's my first day back in town, and I've already found 2 bad apples." Earl let out a low whistle. "Bad apples? Sounds more like rotten to the core. And they're cops?" Andrew nodded. "For now, but not for much longer." Earl adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his expression darkening. "This town's had its problems. Folks talk about the department, but no one's ever had the guts to stand up to 'em. That changes tonight," Andrew said firmly. His voice carried the weight of certainty, a man who knew what needed to be done and how to do it. "They think they're untouchable, but they made a mistake, a big one, and they left me with all the proof I need." Earl didn't press further, sensing that Andrew was a man of action, not words. They drove the rest of the way in silence, the glow of the town's streetlights eventually coming into view. As they approached the station, Andrew could see the building's faint silhouette against the night sky, a squat brick structure that seemed to loom larger than life in the moment. Earl pulled into the station's lot and killed the engine. "You sure you're good from here?" he asked, his concern genuine. Andrew nodded, opening the door. "You've done enough. Thank you." Earl tipped his hat. "Take care of yourself, Chief." Andrew stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way toward the rear entrance of the station. He didn't go through the front, not yet. He wanted to keep things quiet, to approach this moment on his terms. The weight of the night clung to him as he pushed open the door and stepped into the empty back hallway. The station was still and quiet, the kind of stillness that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He walked purposefully to his office, his mind already spinning with what needed to happen next. Sitting down at his desk, he pulled the dashcam memory card from his pocket and inserted it into his laptop. His hands moved quickly, scanning the footage until he found what he was looking for. There it was, the entire incident captured in sharp detail. The audio was crystal clear. Henderson's smug remarks, Dempsey's sneering laughter, the sound of the rope tightening around his arms. Every moment of their misconduct was laid bare. Andrew leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. He had the evidence, but this wasn't just about punishing 2 corrupt officers. It was about setting a precedent, about showing the entire department and the town that things were going to be different under his watch. He made copies of the footage, uploading it to a secure cloud drive and emailing it to a trusted contact at the district attorney's office. He knew better than to leave all his eggs in one basket. Then, he prepared a short statement for the mayor, ensuring that the town's leadership was aware of what had transpired. Finally, he turned his attention to the station's internal messaging system. With a few keystrokes, he summoned every on-duty officer to the briefing room. It was time to address the problem head-on. The officers filed into the room one by one, their expressions ranging from curiosity to unease. Henderson and Dempsey were among them, their cocky demeanor intact, unaware of what awaited them. Andrew stood at the front of the room, arms crossed, his sharp gaze scanning the group. When everyone was seated, he began. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Andrew Harrington. As of today, I am your new chief of police." There was a murmur of acknowledgement, but Henderson and Dempsey exchanged smug glances, clearly unimpressed. Andrew continued, his tone sharpening. "I'm here to make one thing very clear. This department will operate with integrity, accountability, and respect. That is not a suggestion. It's a mandate." He paused, letting his words sink in before pressing a button on the projector. The screen behind him flickered to life, displaying a still from the dashcam footage. Henderson and Dempsey tying him to the post, their faces frozen in mocking grins. The room fell silent. The smugness drained from Henderson and Dempsey's faces as they realized what was happening. "This," Andrew said, gesturing to the screen, is not just a lapse in judgment. It's a gross abuse of power, a violation of public trust, and a disgrace to this badge. He advanced the footage, playing a short clip that captured their taunts and actions in vivid detail. Gasps rippled through the room as their colleagues watched, some looking away in discomfort, while others sat rigid with shock. Andrew turned to face Henderson and Dempsey, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Do you have anything to say for yourselves?" Henderson opened his mouth, but no words came out. Dempsey looked down, his face pale. "Nothing?" Andrew said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Then allow me. As of this moment, you are both relieved of duty. Turn in your badges and weapons." Henderson finally found his voice. "Chief, we didn't mean—" "Didn't mean?" Andrew interrupted, his tone razor-sharp. "Didn't mean to tie me to a post? Didn't mean to mock the very principles this department is supposed to uphold? Spare me your excuses." Dempsey tried to protest. "It was just a joke." "This isn't a joke," Andrew snapped. "This is your career, or at least it was." The two officers sat frozen, their humiliation complete. Slowly, they removed their badges and weapons, placing them on the table in front of them. Andrew addressed the room once more. "Let this serve as a warning. Corruption, misconduct, and abuse of power will not be tolerated, not under my leadership. If you're here to do the job right, you'll have my full support. If you're here for anything less, I suggest you find another line of work." He turned back to Henderson and Dempsey. "You have 5 minutes to clear out." The two men stood, their heads bowed, and shuffled out of the room under the watchful eyes of their peers. As the door closed behind them, a quiet murmur of approval spread through the remaining officers. Andrew looked around the room, his expression firm but resolute. "This is the beginning of a new era. It's not going to be easy, but it will be worth it. Now, let's get to work." The officers nodded, their respect for their new chief already beginning to take root. Andrew left the room, heading back to his office with a renewed sense of purpose. The storm had passed, but the real work was only just beginning. As Andrew Harrington stepped back into his office, the adrenaline from the confrontation still coursed through his veins. The precinct's silence outside his door was telling. The officers were grappling with what had just unfolded. He had drawn a line in the sand, and now it was time to solidify that stance. He sat down at his desk, his fingers drumming against the wooden surface as he mentally mapped out the steps needed to rebuild trust, not just within the department, but with the community they served. Andrew pulled out a worn notebook from his desk drawer. It wasn't just any notebook. It contained notes he'd jotted down over the years, ideas on how to transform law enforcement into a profession of integrity and service. Tonight, it was time to start putting those ideas into action. Meanwhile, in the break room, the remaining officers gathered in small clusters, their voices hushed but charged with emotion. The fallout from Andrew's decisive action against Henderson and Dempsey was the only topic of conversation. "I've never seen anything like that," one officer murmured. "He didn't just talk about accountability, he showed it." "I think we needed it," another said, leaning against the counter. "It's been too long since anyone held people responsible around here." "But 2 officers in one night?" someone else whispered, their tone skeptical. "What if it backfires? What if people start walking on eggshells?" "If you're doing your job right, you shouldn't have to worry," the first officer shot back. The group fell into a contemplative silence. For years, the department had operated in a gray area, with favoritism and a lack of accountability slowly eroding its reputation. Tonight had sent a clear message. Those days were over. Across town, word of the evening's events began to spread. Small-town gossip worked faster than any formal announcement, and by the time the sun rose, almost everyone in Clayton Ridge would know that their new chief had fired 2 officers for misconduct. While some residents were skeptical, others felt a flicker of hope. At a local diner, a waitress named Clara overheard a table of older men discussing the incident. "About time someone cleaned up that department," one man said. his coffee cup clinking against the saucer. "I heard they were crooked," another added, "but I never thought anyone would actually do something about it." Clara smiled as she refilled their cups. "Sounds like this Harrington guy means business." Back at the station, Andrew worked late into the night. He'd scheduled an all-hands meeting for the next morning, intending to outline his vision for the department's future. But tonight, his focus was on rebuilding the framework of trust and respect that the department had lost over the years. He drafted a new code of conduct, emphasizing transparency, community engagement, and ethical behavior. He outlined training programs focused on de-escalation and bias awareness, determined to root out any remnants of the toxic culture that had festered under previous leadership. His desk phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was the mayor. "Andrew," the mayor's voice came through, sounding cautious but intrigued. "I just heard what happened tonight. You've made quite the statement." "Good," Andrew replied, leaning back in his chair. "The department needed it." "You're not worried about backlash?" Andrew exhaled, his gaze steady. "If doing the right thing causes backlash, then so be it. I wasn't hired to keep the peace among corrupt officers. I was hired to fix this department." The mayor chuckled. "Fair enough. I'll stand by you, but be prepared. Change won't come easy. You've rattled some cages tonight." "That was the point," Andrew said firmly. "And we're just getting started." The next morning, the precinct bustled with a sense of urgency. Officers filed into the briefing room for the all-hands meeting, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. Andrew stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding but approachable. He held a folder in one hand, his other resting on the edge of the podium. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but firm. "Last night, we addressed a serious issue within this department. Moving forward, I want to make one thing clear. Integrity is non-negotiable. We are here to serve and protect this community, not ourselves." He opened the folder, revealing the new code of conduct. "This is where it starts. These guidelines will define who we are and how we operate. They're not suggestions, they're expectations. If you're not prepared to meet them, now's the time to step aside." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I've also implemented new training programs," Andrew continued. "These will focus on building trust with the community, improving our response tactics, and ensuring that we treat every citizen with respect and dignity. We're not just cleaning house, we're rebuilding it." One officer raised a hand. "Chief, what if the community doesn't trust us? It's been years of, well, you know." Andrew nodded. "It's going to take time and it's going to take effort, but trust is built through actions, not words. We start by holding ourselves to the highest standards, and we don't stop until we've earned their trust back." As the meeting ended, the officers left the room with a mix of determination and apprehension. Change wasn't easy, but for the first time in years, it felt possible. Andrew returned to his office, his mind already on the next steps. He wasn't just leading a department, he was reshaping a culture, one decision at a time. The road ahead would be challenging, but Andrew Harrington had never been one to back down from a fight. And now, with the precinct's respect slowly building behind him, he was ready to prove that true leadership wasn't about authority. It was about accountability, service, and a relentless commitment to doing what was right. Andrew remained in his office after the meeting, his thoughts racing as he prepared for the inevitable challenges ahead. While many of the officers had left the briefing room with visible determination, others had been quieter, their faces betraying skepticism or outright discomfort. Change was never easy, and Andrew knew that for some, it would be an uphill battle to accept. He leaned back in his chair, gazing at the small window that overlooked the street. The quiet town outside seemed oblivious to the storm of transformation brewing within its police department. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what he had taken on, the resistance, the scrutiny, and the countless late nights that lay ahead. But as quickly as doubt crept in, he pushed it aside. This was his mission, and he wouldn't falter. That evening, Andrew began his next task, reviewing the department's outstanding cases and complaints. The files painted a troubling picture. There were incidents that had been swept under the rug, grievances from citizens ignored, and investigations stalled without explanation. Each file he opened seemed to confirm what he already suspected. The department had become complacent, prioritizing internal loyalties over its duty to the community. One case in particular caught his eye: a formal complaint filed months ago by a local business owner who alleged harassment by officers during a routine traffic stop. The complaint had been marked as resolved, but the notes in the file were suspiciously vague. Andrew's jaw tightened as he read through the details. This wasn't resolution. It was negligence. He made a note to follow up with the complainant personally. It was a small step, but one that could signal to the community that things were changing. The next morning, Andrew began his day with a surprise visit to the squad room. He arrived early, coffee in hand, and took a seat at one of the desks. Officers trickled in, their expressions ranging from curious to uneasy. It was clear that his presence wasn't something they had expected. Andrew didn't address them immediately. Instead, he observed, listening to the banter and noting the dynamics within the group. When the room was nearly full, he finally stood, drawing the attention of every officer present. "I wanted to start the day with you all," he said, his tone calm but commanding. "Not as your chief giving orders, but as a part of this team. I know that what we're doing isn't easy, and I know some of you may be questioning whether we can actually make a difference." He paused, meeting the eyes of each officer. "But I also know that deep down, every one of you came into this job because you wanted to help people. That's what we're here to do, and that's what we're going to focus on from now on." The room was silent. A few officers nodded, while others avoided his gaze. Andrew continued, his voice firm but encouraging. "I'm not here to be your enemy. I'm here to make sure that this department becomes something we can all be proud of. If you're willing to be part of that, then I'm with you every step of the way." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before sitting back down, signaling the end of his impromptu speech. The officers returned to their tasks, but there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Andrew could feel it, small but meaningful. As the day unfolded, Andrew made good on his promise to engage with the community. He personally visited the business owner who had filed the complaint, sitting down in the quiet cafe she owned. Her initial wariness softened as Andrew listened intently to her story, apologizing on behalf of the department and assuring her that the matter would be revisited. Later, he walked through the town's main street, greeting shop owners and residents, taking the time to introduce himself and hear their concerns. Many were surprised to see the new chief out in the open, mingling with the people he served. Word spread quickly, and by the time Andrew returned to the station, the precinct phone was ringing off the hook with messages of appreciation and curiosity about the new leadership. The following evening, Andrew called a meeting with his senior staff. They gathered in the conference room, the air heavy with anticipation. Some of the veterans in the department had been skeptical of Andrew's approach, but they couldn't deny the changes taking shape. "We have a lot of work ahead," Andrew began, laying out a series of plans for restructuring the department's operations. He spoke about implementing new policies, fostering better relationships with the community, and creating a culture of accountability. While some resisted, others embraced the vision, offering ideas and sharing their own frustrations with the old way of doing things. As the meeting progressed, Andrew's leadership began to take root. Even the skeptics found it difficult to argue with his logic and determination. By the time the meeting ended, a sense of cautious optimism had begun to spread among the staff. That night, as Andrew locked up his office, he felt a rare sense of satisfaction. The road ahead was still long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time, he could see the department moving in the right direction. It wasn't just about firing corrupt officers or implementing new rules. It was about building something sustainable, something that could withstand the pressures of time and politics. Andrew knew the battle wasn't over. There would be setbacks, resistance, and moments of doubt. But as he turned off the lights and stepped into the crisp night air, he felt ready for whatever lay ahead. For the first time in years, the precinct and the community it served had a reason to hope. As Andrew left the station and drove home that night, the events of the past few days replayed in his mind like a series of scenes in a tightly wound drama. Every decision he made felt like a drop in the bucket compared to the weight of systemic change he hoped to bring about. The quiet hum of his car engine did little to silence the whirlwind of thoughts. Could he truly trust his officers to embrace the change, or were some of them merely biding their time, waiting for him to slip? The next morning, Andrew arrived early, as was becoming his habit. He preferred to walk through the precinct before the day officially began, observing the mood of the place without the noise of daily activity. Today felt different. There was an uneasy quiet in the air, and as he moved through the halls, he caught subtle glances exchanged between officers, conversations that stopped the moment he came near. The tension became impossible to ignore during roll call. Shaw, seated at the back of the room, leaned against the wall with an air of defiance, his smirk a clear challenge. Andrew didn't address him directly, but noted the way Shaw's attitude subtly influenced others in the room. He couldn't afford to let this simmer any longer. The cancer of insubordination had to be dealt with swiftly, but with precision. After roll call, Andrew asked Shaw to step into his office. The senior officer strode in with a swagger that only confirmed Andrew's suspicions. As the door shut, Shaw leaned against the desk, his body language brazen. "What's this about, Chief?" he asked, feigning innocence. "Just a friendly chat?" Andrew didn't rise to the bait. He motioned for Shaw to sit, but when the officer refused, Andrew's calm demeanor hardened. "You've been here long enough to know that insubordination and undermining leadership aren't tolerated," Andrew said, his tone measured. "And yet, you've been testing those limits since I arrived." Shaw shrugged, his smirk widening. "Just calling it like I see it. Some of us have been here a lot longer than you, Chief. Maybe you should take a page out of our book." Andrew leaned forward, his gaze sharp enough to cut through steel. "And what book would that be, Shaw? The one where officers look the other way when their colleagues abuse power, or the one where a sense of entitlement replaces integrity?" Shaw's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "You think you can change everything overnight? Good luck with that. People don't like being told how to do their jobs by someone who doesn't understand what it's like out there." Andrew stood, his presence commanding. "I know more about what it's like out there than you realize, Shaw. But this isn't about me. It's about the people we're sworn to protect. If you can't get on board with that, I'll gladly accept your resignation. Until then, you'll follow my orders to the letter. Are we clear?" The tension between them was electric. Shaw held Andrew's gaze, his defiance slowly giving way to something more subdued. Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving Andrew alone in his office. The rest of the day passed without incident, but Andrew knew the confrontation had set the stage for a larger battle. Shaw's resistance was a symptom of the deeper problems within the department. Winning over officers like him would be crucial, but it wouldn't be easy. By late afternoon, Andrew received a call from Internal Affairs. The case against Henderson and Dempsey was moving forward, and the evidence Andrew had provided was deemed airtight. The IA officer on the other end commended him for his swift action, but Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the tip of the iceberg. Later that evening, Andrew returned to his office, poring over reports and complaints that had long been ignored. Each file was a story, a thread in the tangled web of corruption and neglect that he was determined to unravel. He worked late into the night, fueled by a mix of frustration and resolve. As he finally locked up and stepped outside, the cold night air wrapped around him like a reminder of the battles yet to come. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. Change wouldn't come easy, but it was already in motion, and Andrew Harrington wasn't the type to back down. As Andrew left the precinct that night, He couldn't ignore the lingering weight of the confrontation with Shaw. The cracks in the department's foundation were showing, and while some officers supported his efforts to reform, others seemed poised to resist at every turn. Change wasn't a battle he could fight alone. He needed allies. But trust was a fragile thing, and in a department steeped in old habits, even identifying who could be trusted was a challenge. The following morning, Andrew held a closed-door meeting with a handful of officers he believed were committed to integrity. Among them were Detective Rachel Myers, Officer Peter Chavez, and Lieutenant Carla Simmons. Each had shown either verbal support or taken quiet steps to uphold the values Andrew was trying to instill. "I've brought you here because I believe you want what's best for this department," Andrew began, looking each officer in the eye. "But we can't afford to act in isolation. The changes we're implementing won't stick unless we're united. I need to know if I can count on you, not just to do your job, but to stand up when it gets tough." Rachel, a sharp-witted detective with a reputation for getting results without cutting corners, was the first to respond. "Chief, I'm with you. This place has needed a shake-up for years. But you've got to know the old guard isn't just going to roll over. They're watching every move you make, waiting for you to slip." Carla Simmons, whose calm demeanor masked a fierce sense of justice, nodded in agreement. "It's true. Officers like Shaw have a lot of sway with the rank and file. They'll try to paint you as the outsider who doesn't understand how things work." Andrew leaned forward, his tone resolute. "They're right about one thing. I don't understand how things worked before, and I don't want to. I didn't come here to fit in. I came here to fix what's broken." Peter Chavez, one of the youngest officers in the room, spoke up hesitantly. "Chief, I want to believe in what you're doing, but the culture here, it's like quicksand. If you push too hard, too fast, it'll pull you under." Andrew appreciated the candor, even as it reinforced the uphill battle he faced. "That's why I need all of you," he said. "This isn't about me. It's about what kind of department we leave behind. If we stand together, we can shift the tide. But if we let fear dictate our actions, nothing will change." The meeting ended with cautious optimism. While the officers in the room expressed their support, Andrew knew it would take more than words to solidify their commitment. Actions would speak louder, and the next test wasn't far off. Later that afternoon, a call came in about a domestic disturbance in a lower-income neighborhood notorious for being overlooked by the department. Andrew decided to respond personally, bringing Rachel and Peter along. As they arrived on the scene, they found a chaotic situation. A man yelling on a front porch, a woman clutching a crying child inside, and neighbors gathered, watching the commotion unfold. The man, clearly intoxicated, turned his ire on the officers the moment they stepped out of their vehicle. "What the hell are you doing here?" he shouted, stumbling toward them. "You don't care about people like us." Andrew's voice was firm but calm as he stepped forward. "Sir, we're here to help. Let's talk this through." Rachel and Peter flanked him, their presence steadying the situation. As Andrew engaged the man, Rachel moved to speak with the woman inside, while Peter kept the crowd at bay. It was a delicate dance, but the team's coordinated approach de-escalated the tension within minutes. After the situation was resolved, the woman thanked Andrew tearfully, saying it was the first time she'd felt truly heard by the police. As they drove back to the station, Peter broke the silence. "You didn't have to come out here yourself, Chief. Most brass wouldn't bother." Andrew glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "That's exactly why I had to. If we're going to rebuild trust, it starts with showing up. Every call, every person matters." Back at the precinct, word of Andrew's involvement spread quickly. For some, it reinforced their respect for his leadership. For others, like Shaw, it was another reason to dig in their heels. That evening, Andrew found an anonymous note slipped under his office door. Written in sharp, angry handwriting, it read, "You're in over your head. Leave before it's too late." Andrew stared at the note for a long moment, the words a stark reminder of the resistance he faced. But instead of fear, he felt a surge of determination. Whoever wrote the note underestimated him, just like Harper and Green had underestimated him that fateful night on the road. And just like them, they would soon learn that Andrew Harrington was not a man who backed down. The path ahead was fraught with challenges, but Andrew knew one thing for certain. He was prepared to fight for the soul of the department, no matter the cost. Change wasn't just coming, it was already here, and Andrew intended to see it through to the end.